In October of 2009, a livestock specialist from the Harlan County Extension Office arrived at the Bodie Vance farm on Sulphur Creek Road with a clipboard and a projection printed on university letterhead. He had driven 45 minutes on county highways to get there, and his boots were clean when he climbed out of the white pickup. The truck had the university seal on the door and the Extension Service logo below it, and it was the cleanest vehicle that had been on that gravel drive in some time. He walked the perimeter of the rooting pen slowly, counting the animals with a stylus against his tablet, pausing at the gate to survey the timber beyond where the 50 dark-coated hogs were moving through the leaves. He had the projection in his folder before he arrived. He had run the numbers on the 40-minute drive, and they had not improved. He stood with Bodie at the gate and said what he came to say. He called the operation a recluse's hobby, and he meant it without cruelty. He was a man who believed what he had been taught, and what he had been taught was that 50 hogs on 3 acres of mixed hardwood was a memory, not a business. He had the slide deck on his tablet to prove it. Cost per pound of gain. Days to market weight on heritage genetics versus commercial, the premium ceiling on specialty pork at the regional sale barn, the land cost per animal unit amortized across what he judged a reasonable depreciation horizon. Every column came up short. Then it was 2021. A packing house buyer named Stovall, who represented a regional meat collective that sourced for 3 Michelin-rated restaurants in Nashville and 1 in Cincinnati, drove the same county highway, turned at the same mailbox, and sat down at the same kitchen table. He had a purchase order in his briefcase. The figure on that order was $438 per hundredweight. The county average that fall for finished hogs was 61. 12 years between those 2 visits. 12 years of rooting, of foraging, of a method that looked, to everyone who drove past the place, like a man who had simply given up trying to farm correctly. This is that story. Bodie Vance was 61 years old in 2009 and was known in Crawford County for 2 things: his silence, which people read as stubbornness, and his hogs, which people read as a sentimental attachment to a breed the industry had set aside 50 years earlier. He ran Ossabaw Island hogs, a line descended from Spanish stock left on the Georgia Barrier Islands in the 16th century, pigs that had survived isolation and poor forage by developing a metabolism unlike anything the commercial swine world had engineered since. He had gotten his foundation animals from his father's uncle in 1987, a man named Harlan Vance, who had kept the bloodline in a small operation in Whitley County for 31 years before his knees gave out, 22 years before the extension man arrived with his clipboard and Bodie had never crossed them with anything. Not because he was opposed to crossbreeding on principle, because he understood what he had and he did not want to dilute it. The Vance farm was 140 acres on the east slope of a ridge in southeastern Kentucky, most of it timber and undergrowth, with a creek bottom that ran reliable water 10 months out of 12 in a 12-acre pasture, at the top of the rise that Bodie cut once a year and otherwise left to grow. The house was his grandfather's. Sided in tin over the original board and batten, and the barn had not been painted since 1972. His truck was a 1994 Ford that had 211,000 miles on it, and started every morning because Bodie maintained it with the same methodical attention he applied to everything else on the place. To a man from a university who drove a clean white pickup and had a slide deck that accounted for every visible input and output on a standard pork operation, the Vance farm looked like exactly what you'd expect from a man who had stopped competing. He had not stopped competing. He had simply stepped out of a race he did not believe would end well for anyone running it. and he had been watching from the fence long enough to have an opinion about where the runners were heading. Let me tell you what an Osaba hog is, because that is the whole story, and without understanding the animal, you cannot understand the number that arrived in Stovall's briefcase in 2021. The Osaba Island pig is not a modern production animal. It was never selected for lean muscle mass or rapid weight gain or the specific carcass geometry that a large commercial packing line requires. What it was selected for across 4.5 centuries of island living was survival on a feast and famine cycle. The barrier islands off the Georgia coast offered rich mast seasons in fall, when the oaks dropped and the animals could eat their fill and then some, and then very little else for the months that followed. The pigs that made it through the lean months were the ones whose bodies could store energy with unusual efficiency during the fat months, layering intramuscular fat in a dense, evenly distributed pattern throughout the muscle tissue rather than simply depositing it as a surface layer. Modern pork geneticists call this distribution marbling. The same quality, a beef cattleman spends a lifetime of breeding decisions chasing in a Black Angus or a Wagyu cross. The Osaba pig carries as a baseline metabolic trait because the islands starved out every pig that didn't have it. 4 centuries of that pressure built it into the genome as surely as if someone had planned it. The result, in an Osaba finished on hardwood mast and root systems and the diverse forage of a working timber slope, is a fat profile that a food scientist would call oleic acid dominant. The fat in an Osaba, finished on natural forage, is closer in its fatty acid composition to olive oil than to commodity pork fat. It stays soft at cooler temperatures. It bastes the muscle from inside as the meat cooks, rather than running off and leaving the flesh dry. A chef who slices an Osaba loin after roasting and holds it to the light sees something that does not look like what comes in a vacuum-sealed bag from a large packing facility. It looks like a different category of animal, entirely. Bodhi knew none of this vocabulary in 2009. He had a different name for it, which was simply that his hogs tasted right. His father had said the same thing. His father's Uncle Harlan had said it before, that. The vocabulary came later, when people who had the right credentials arrived and named what the Vance family had been quietly selecting for across 3 generations. When Bodhi's hogs rooted the mixed hardwood on the east slope, they were doing exactly what that 4-century breeding program prepared them to do. They ate acorns and hickory nuts, and the root systems of bracken, fern, and whatever grubs they turned up in the leaf litter, and they moved in a pattern that Bodhi had been watching long enough to understand. They did not root one spot to bare dirt and walk away. They moved in loose arcs, following the massed crop as it fell across the slope, favoring the north-facing sides of the blocks where the bur oaks dropped last and the acorn layer was deepest. And when they moved on, the ground behind them looked raw and disturbed for about 2 weeks, and then settled into something a soil scientist would later come out to measure and describe. But that comes later. The extension specialist's name was Gerald Fitch, and he was 43 years old in 2009, sincere and well-trained and genuinely concerned about what he saw as an older man in a failing operation. He had a master's degree from a state agricultural school, and he had spent 16 years advising producers across 4 counties, and in those 16 years he had helped 14 operations successfully transition to modern confinement systems and seen their income stabilize. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a record of success doing exactly what his training said to do. and that record made it difficult to believe that the training could be wrong. He believed in the model he carried, the model that said a profitable pork operation required volume, uniformity, a modern terminal cross, controlled confinement, measured inputs, and a contract with a processor. He looked at Bodie's 50 animals on 3 acres of rooting ground, and he saw the equation come up short every way he ran it. "Mr. Vance," he said at the gate, turning from the tablet to Bodie with the patient expression of a doctor delivering a diagnosis the patient has not yet accepted, "what you've got here is a recluse's hobby. The per-pound return on a heritage breed at the sale barn doesn't pencil out against your land cost and your time. I've run these numbers. Your break-even on 50 head at current specialty premiums doesn't cover your opportunity cost on this acreage." Bodie looked at his hogs for a moment. The animals were working the leaf litter along the north fence, unhurried. One older sow had found something in the ground and was rooting with a slow, methodical patience that Bodie recognized as productive. "I don't sell at the sale barn," he said. Fitch looked up from the tablet. "Where do you sell?" "Direct," Bodie said. "Restaurants, a few families. Word comes around," Fitch typed something. His expression did not change, but he typed it the way a man types something that does not alter his conclusion. He said he could help Bodie access transition funding to move toward a modern operation. The state had a cost-share program for confinement improvements, and there was a Duroc Hampshire cross that was doing exceptionally well in the county on a 70-day finish schedule. He said the breed had been developed specifically for the regional processor's carcass specifications, and the premiums were reliable. Bodie listened to this. He did not argue with it. He asked Fitch if he wanted coffee, and Fitch said he had another appointment and needed to get on. He left a folder of materials on the kitchen table, a blue folder with the university logo on the cover and 40 pages of production guides inside, which Bodie set under the leg of a kitchen chair that had always rocked slightly on an uneven floor, and the folder stayed there for 11 years. The chair stopped rocking. If you've ever watched something that looked like a failure running quiet underneath a thing that looked like success, you know something about this story. Tell me, in a comment, what you've seen that looked like one thing and turned out to be another. And stay with me, because the number Gerald Fitch drove away from in 2009 is coming, and it is going to settle something. 12 miles up the same road, Gary Pruitt had been farming hogs since 2003. Gary was Bodie's age within 4 years, and they had gone to the same consolidated high school, though Gary had graduated from the agriculture program at a community college and had taken the extension service's advice consistently across a 20-year career. He ran a 400-head farrow-to-finish operation in confinement, modern Cambro crosses, computer-controlled ventilation, a feed contract with a regional mill, and a marketing contract with a large processor in Indiana that locked his price quarterly and took delivery twice a year. In 2009, he had borrowed $340,000 to expand his finishing barn and add a second waste lagoon. For the additional headcount, the banknote was at 5.25% on a 15-year term. The monthly payment was $2,720. Gary's operation looked to everyone who drove past it like a serious farm. The buildings were metal and new, and the finishing barn had a digital readout panel on the outside wall that showed the internal temperature and ventilation rate. There was no visible mud except in the holding pens adjacent to the loading chute, which were concrete and power washed twice a month. His hogs were finished at 265 pounds in 165 days on average, which was within the processor's target window. and the carcass uniformity grade was consistently in the top tier of the contract specifications. He sold 2 turns of finished hogs a year, roughly 380 to 400 head each turn, after mortality, into the processor contract. And in a good year, he cleared enough to service the debt and the feed contract and the electricity bill and the equipment maintenance. Gerald Fitch had advised him in 2009 that the expansion would put the operation on a sound footing for the coming decade, and Fitch had been right about most of the math. The two men saw each other at the Crawford County Farm Bureau meeting every February, and Gerald Fitch attended that meeting too as the Extension Service's representative, and on 3 consecutive February evenings across 2010, 2012, and 2015, he referred to Bodie's operation in the course of his remarks about market opportunities and producer choices. He never did it unkindly. He did it the way a teacher might cite a cautionary example without naming the student directly, though in a county of 12,000 people, the anonymity was more courtesy than fact. In 2010, he called it a recluse's hobby in the context of a talk about scale thresholds for sustainable pork operations. He meant that an operation of 50 head on 3 acres could not, by any projection he could run, provide a family a sustainable income at current market prices. He was not wrong about that, exactly. He was measuring the wrong thing. In 2012, he called the same type of operation a heritage sentiment when he was discussing a USDA study on consumer willingness to pay premiums for specialty pork. The study showed that willingness to pay existed, but that it was confined to urban and near-urban markets that most Crawford County producers could not practically access. He noted that a handful of producers might find value in heritage breeds if their personal situations aligned with the market geography. He meant it as an olive branch. It landed as a smaller version of the first dismissal. In February of 2015, with specialty agriculture getting more coverage in the farm press and a few other Crawford County producers beginning to explore direct market channels, he said with a measured even-handedness that was almost more expensive than the original dismissal, that boutique operations could find a niche if producers were comfortable with the volume constraints that came with inefficient breeds and inefficient land use. He paused after the word boutique, the way people do when they have chosen a word carefully and want it heard. Bodie was sitting in the back row each time. He attended the meeting because he believed in attending things, which was a principle his father had held, and because he wanted to know what the Extension Service was telling the county's farmers. He did not respond. He drove home on Sulphur Creek Road in the 1994 Ford and fed his hogs, and checked the rotation and noted in a small notebook where the animals had moved that day. He had been keeping that notebook since 1993. Let me tell you what those hogs were doing to 3 acres of hardwood slope across 18 years, because Gerald Fitch's model had no column for it, and neither did Gary Pruitt's balance sheet. And the absence of that column is the whole story. When Bodie's Ossabaw pigs rooted the east slope acre blocks in rotation, they were not simply foraging. They were performing a soil function that no piece of equipment Bodie could have purchased would have replicated, and certainly not at the scale his 50 animals did it. Their snouts broke the compaction layer at 6 to 8 inches, which is the depth at which decades of undisturbed leaf litter accumulation creates a dense, felted mat that repels water rather than absorbing it. Timber ground that has never been disturbed by animals or cultivation develops this mat over time, and the result is a soil surface that sheds rainfall almost as efficiently as a paved surface, sending it sideways into the drainage rather than down into the water table. Every pass Bodie's hogs made through that mat broke it open, mixing the carbon-rich surface material down into the mineral soil below, a process that soil scientists call biological incorporation, and which Bodhi's grandfather had described to his father in simpler terms, saying the hogs do the plowing. What incorporation does, when it is done by animals, moving in patterns dictated by their own foraging instincts, rather than by a tractor running a fixed implement path, is create a porous, biologically active soil profile that holds water differently than either compacted timber ground or conventionally tilled cropland. The mycorrhizal networks, which are the fine fungal threads that connect root systems underground and transfer both water and nutrients between plants across a forest stand, survive Osaba rooting in ways they do not survive a disc harrow or a deep till implement. The difference is pattern. A tractor runs a systematic grid. The hogs follow the mast and the grubs, which meant their disturbance was selective and patchy, leaving the fungal architecture mostly intact in the undisturbed ground between their paths, even as they opened the compaction and mixed the organics where they chose to work. The selective disturbance mimicked the pattern of a healthy forest floor managed by wild boar, which is exactly what the timber soil had evolved to receive. Bodhi rotated his 50 animals through 5 one-acre blocks on a 60-day cycle, moving them by opening one gate and closing another, a process that took about 15 minutes and that he had done so many times he did it without thinking. By the time the herd returned to the first block, that block had had 60 days of recovery, and the ground that had looked raw and churned and destroyed after the pass was showing new growth, green at the surface, enriched from below by what the animals had deposited, and from above by the rain that was now staying in the soil rather than running off. He had been doing this since 1991. By 2009, 18 years in, a soil probe in the rooted blocks showed organic matter levels at 4.5%. In ground that had tested at 1.25%, that is a difference that takes a commodity row crop operation 40 years of cover cropping and no-till management to approach, assuming it gets the management right every season. And Bodhi had achieved it with 50 pigs and a rotation he designed by watching where they wanted to go. There were also 140 acres of improved soil, 12 acres of well-watered pasture that held green through August droughts, and a creek bottom that ran clean and cold through the hottest summers the county had seen in a generation, all of it downstream from the rooted blocks. Gerald Fitch's model had no column for this because it measured inputs and outputs per hundredweight, and its time horizon was a processor contract cycle, not a soil carbon accumulation curve measured across a decade. Bodhi's granddaughter, Lena, came back from the University of Tennessee in 2013 with a degree in agricultural economics and a clear set of opinions about heritage breeds and small operation margins. She was 23, and she loved her grandfather without reservation, and she thought he was running the wrong race. She had written a paper in her senior year about the economics of specialty livestock production in Appalachian Kentucky, and the conclusions had not been favorable to operations under 100 head. She had not used the Vance farm as a case study because she already knew what the numbers would show. She told him so at the kitchen table in March of 2014, with her laptop open to a USDA market report and a spreadsheet she had built on the drive up from Knoxville, modeling 4 different premium scenarios for heritage pork in direct market channels. The kitchen was the same as it had always been: the oilcloth on the table, the hanging lamp above it, the blue folder under the chair leg. She noticed the folder and thought about asking, but she was focused on her spreadsheet. "Grandpa," she said, "even at triple the current specialty premium, you can't get to a sustainable income number. You've got 50 animals. The volume ceiling is the problem. You can't scale this." Bodhi looked at her spreadsheet. He looked at it for a long time, which she took as consideration, and which was simply his way of being polite to something he did not agree with. He had been looking at spreadsheets other people brought him for 30 years, and he knew what they could and could not see. "I'm not trying to scale it," he said. She heard this as resignation. She spent the next hour going through the premium scenarios with him, and he listened to each one, and he asked one question about each one, and the questions were always about what the model had left out. She did not notice the pattern until much later. She thought he was deflecting. He was doing something else. She drove back to Knoxville with the spreadsheet and a jar of lard Bodie had rendered from the last fall slaughter, because she knew better than to refuse a thing he offered. The lard sat in her refrigerator for 3 months before she ran out of butter one Tuesday evening and used it to sear a piece of chicken, and then she stood at the stove and ate the chicken over the sink and called him before she had finished chewing. "What did you do to this?" she said. "To what?" he said. "The lard, the fat. What's different?" There was a pause on his end. He said, "Nothing." He said, "That's what it tastes like when they eat right." She stood at the sink for a while after she hung up. She did not have a column for that either. In the spring of 2016, a soil scientist named Dr. Renata Cole, attached to a sustainable agriculture research program at a land-grant university in Ohio, came to the Vance farm as part of a multi-site study on alternative land management outcomes in mixed timber operations. She had found the Vance place through a reference in an older extension report on heritage swine production in Appalachian counties, and she had called twice before Bodie answered the phone, and when she described what she wanted to do, he said she could come if she wanted. She brought a graduate student named Marcus and a set of soil probes and a water infiltration rig called a double-ring infiltrometer, which measures how fast water enters the soil at a given point. She spent 2 days on the property, moving through the blocks in an order she had planned before she arrived. Her infiltration measurements on the rooted blocks showed water absorption at 4.2 inches per hour. The unmanaged timber adjacent to the rooting ground, which had never been touched by the pigs because it sat outside the fence, showed 0.9 inches per hour. The county's conventionally farmed ground, which she tested at 3 neighboring operations for comparison, after explaining the study and asking permission, showed 0.3 to 0.6 inches per hour. She stood at the fence line between the rooted block and the conventional cornfield to the north, looking at the infiltrometer readings on her clipboard, and she did not say anything for a while. The graduate student was running the numbers on his tablet. The cornfield on the other side of the fence was planted in a uniform Bt hybrid, standing about 4 inches high in the April chill, and the ground between the rows was sealed hard from the previous autumn's tillage and the spring rain's impact. "The hog rotation is functioning as a keystone soil process," she said to Marcus. Then she turned to Bodie. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since 1991, he said. She wrote something in a field notebook with a worn spiral binding. She and Marcus spent another 4 hours that afternoon pulling soil cores and discussing between themselves what they were finding. Bodie made them supper, and they stayed until dark. She published a paper the following year in a peer-reviewed soil science journal, and one of its central findings was that the Hogs rooting behavior, when managed in a rotation with sufficient recovery time between passes, produce soil structure outcomes functionally equivalent to decades of certified organic management without the mycorrhizal disruption that tillage-based organic methods produce. The paper's third footnote cited the operation by county and ridge region. Nobody in Crawford County read it at the time. Gary Pruitt read it eventually in the spring of 2019 when a colleague forwarded it to him with a note. By then, he had other things on his mind. The summer of 2019 was the hottest sustained stretch in southeastern Kentucky since reliable records began. June through August brought 41 days above 94 degrees, and the county received 3.1 inches of rain across that span, against a normal of 11.4 inches for those months. The corn in the leased ground, to the north of Bodie's place, planted in the sealed, tight ground that had tested at 0.4 inches per hour, our on Dr. Cole's infiltrometer, went into pollination stress in late June and never recovered. The silks dried before the pollen could set. The county average corn yield that fall was 61 bushels per acre against a 10-year average of 142. For Gary Pruitt, the summer brought a different kind of damage. His ventilation system ran at maximum capacity from the 10th of June through the 22nd of August, the fans cycling continuously around the clock to keep the confinement barn below the threshold at which modern commercial hogs go into respiratory distress. His electricity bill for those 11 weeks was $19,400, against a normal summer bill of $6,800. 3 of his finishing pen environmental control units failed under the sustained load and had to be replaced at $4,200 each, a total of $12,600 that came out of the operating account in July when the account had expected a quieter month. His hogs went into measurable heat stress during the mid-July peak, and his average daily gain dropped by 22% across the barn for 6 consecutive weeks, which pushed his slaughter dates back by 19 days and compressed his margins against the processor contract price, which was a fixed quarterly rate and did not adjust for heat stress performance losses. He also lost 14 head to a respiratory illness that spread through the confinement building during the sustained heat, at a combined loss of approximately $3,100 at estimated slaughter weight. His summer debt service on the $340,000 note ran as scheduled regardless. When he tallied the summer, the heat event had cost him approximately $34,000 in combined losses, counting the electricity overage, the 3 failed units, the delayed slaughter weight shortfall against the contract. He had margin in the operation in a normal year. He did not have margin for a summer that had, the meteorologist said, about a 1 in 12 probability of occurring in any given year. Bodie's hogs were in the timber. The canopy on the east slope held the temperature in the rooting blocks at roughly 12 degrees below ambient on the hottest days, measured in the second week of July when the county road temperature hit 98 degrees, and Bodie held a thermometer at chest height in the deepest block for no particular reason except curiosity. The animals were using the creek bottom as a wallow, lying in the water along the edges in the afternoon hours and moving back into the rooting blocks in the morning and evening when the temperature dropped. The creek ran clean and cold and continuous because the rooted soil upstream absorbed the spring rain rather than shedding it, banking it in the soil column against exactly this kind of summer. Bodie lost no animals to heat. His average daily gain held within normal range because the Ossabaw metabolism, shaped by 4 centuries of feast and famine cycles on the barrier islands, regulated its energy use during periods of heat and forage, stress without the catastrophic performance drop that a modern high-gain terminal cross. The Ossabaw pig had been stress-tolerant for 400 years. The 2019 drought was not the hardest thing its bloodline had survived. In August, Bodie noticed that the pasture at the top of the rise was green. Not pale and fighting to stay alive, but genuinely green the way a May pasture looks when the rain has come regularly. It was the only green field visible from the county road for 2 miles in either direction. The surrounding farms had gone to brown in late June and stayed there. The water that had fallen in April was still in the soil at the top of the Vance Rise, held at depth in the structure that 18 years of hog rotation had built above the creek drainage. It was not magic, it was arithmetic. It was 4.5% organic matter, holding water against the pull of gravity and the heat of July, and it was still there in August. Gary Pruitt drove past that pasture on his way to the feed mill in late August on a morning when the temperature was 97 degrees by 9 o'clock. He slowed when he saw the color. He did not stop. He had too many other things to think about, and he was not yet ready to think about this particular thing. Gerald Fitch retired from the Extension Service in the spring of 2020 after 31 years. He sent a printed note to his producer, contacts across 4 counties, thanking them for their partnership and wishing them well with the incoming specialist. Bodie was not on the list, which was not a slight, simply an omission from a database that had never included him. Lena heard about the retirement at a Farm Bureau event in the fall of 2020, and she mentioned it to her grandfather at Christmas, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had opened the spreadsheet in 2014. He was trying to help, Bodie said. I know he was, Lena said. She had come back to the farm 4 times between 2014 and 2019, and each visit had changed her relationship to the spreadsheet she had brought the first time. By 2017, she had stopped printing out market reports. By 2019, she had stopped bringing the laptop at all. She had started bringing a notebook instead, the spiral-bound kind, and she had been writing things down. The rotation schedule, the block recovery notes, the finishing observations, the remarks her grandfather made when he thought she was not particularly listening. In the spring of 2020, she moved back to Crawford County. She took a part-time position with a regional food hub based in Corbin that connected specialty producers to institutional and restaurant buyers in the Mid-South, and she began the slower work of learning what her grandfather had been building in the rooted acres for 3 decades. She was 30 years old, and she understood now that the spreadsheet had not been measuring the right things. She did not say this to Bodie in so many words. She did not need to. He had been waiting for her to arrive at it in her own time, which was, she recognized, the same patience he applied to everything else on the farm. The buyer, named Stovall, had been sourcing heritage pork for restaurant accounts in Nashville and Cincinnati since 2017. He operated as an independent procurement specialist, representing a collective of 4 establishments whose chefs had reached a point in their sourcing where price was secondary to provenance and flavor documentation. He had worked through the Food Hub network, and Lena had introduced herself to him at a regional food systems conference in Lexington in the spring of 2020. She did not pitch him. She gave him a jar of the rendered lard and told him where it came from and said he could call her if he had questions. He used it at home 3 days later and called her the following morning. He came to the farm in September of 2021. He was a precise man in his mid-50s trim, with the quiet authority of someone who has spent 20 years making consequential judgments about quality, and has been right often enough to trust his own palate completely. He had a vocabulary for fat quality and intramuscular distribution and oleic acid profiles that Bodie had never heard assembled in that particular order. He asked to walk the rooting blocks after dark so he could see the soil structure in the probe holes Lena had made that afternoon, using a flashlight held at a low angle to show the layering. He stood at the fence in the morning and watched the 50 animals moving through the timber, not saying anything for 10 minutes. Then he asked Bodie one question. Are these the same bloodline you started with? Same stock, Bodie said. Different generation, Harlan Vance's line. Stovall looked at the animals for another moment. He nodded once. Then he opened his briefcase on the tailgate of Bodie's truck and took out a purchase order that he had already filled in. The number was $438 per hundredweight. The county average that fall for finished hogs was $61. Bodie read the number twice. He set the paper on the tailgate, and he did not say anything. Lena, standing 6 feet away with her notebook, stopped writing. The morning was very quiet. A crow called once from the timber on the east slope, and then did not call again. $438. The county average for a finished hog that fall was 61. Stovall said, "I won't negotiate this number. This is what they are worth." Bodie picked the paper up again. He folded it once along the crease Stovall had made, and he put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "I can give you 40 animals a year. Not more than that." Stovall said that was what he had come for. That number, 438 against 61, did not travel fast. It was not announced anywhere. It was not put in a press release or posted to a social media account or mentioned at the Farm Bureau meeting. It was recorded in Lena's notebook and in Stovall's purchase order and in the financial records of the Vance farm, and it sat there the way a very heavy thing sits, quietly taking up exactly as much space as it needs and waiting for the weight to be noticed. The second purchase order came in February of 2022 for the same volume at a slightly higher price. Stovall's chefs had begun to attribute the fat profile of the Vance pork to their menus specifically, and one of the Nashville establishments had named the breed and the farm in a tasting menu description, which was the kind of attribution that moved in Food World networks faster than anything a county extension office would recognize as marketing. Gary Pruitt heard about the Vance farm at the Farm Bureau meeting in February of 2022. He was sitting in the back now, which was not his usual position. He had come to the meeting specifically because the new extension specialist had announced a session on specialty and alternative livestock markets, a topic that would not have interested him in 2015. When the specialist mentioned heritage swine premiums in the region, and someone in the room asked for a local example, Gary heard the name Vance and the price, and he sat with it for a week before he drove out. He and Bodie stood at the gate to the rooting pen and looked at the timber. It was a cold March morning, and the hogs were in the second block, a sound of them moving through the dry leaves. Gary was a good man who had made good faith decisions based on the best information he had been given, and the information had been right about many things, and wrong about the things that mattered most when the heat came. He did not say this. He said, "How do you rotate them?" Bodie took him through it the way he would show anyone who asked. 5 blocks, 60-day cycle move. By opening one gate, check the recovery before you return. No chemical inputs after the first 60 days. No purchased supplemental feed during the mast season. No ventilation system to maintain. No lagoon permit to renew. Gary asked about the soil work, and Bodie handed him the printout from Dr. Had R. Cole's study and waited while he read it. Gary read it twice. "I've got a mortgage," Gary said. "I know it," Bodie said. There was nothing cruel in the conversation. Gary had a $340,000 note with a balance still at $198,000 in the spring of 2022, and a confinement building that had cost him $34,000 in one bad summer and 2 decades of capital investment in a system that was not wrong exactly, just wrong at the time horizon that mattered, and increasingly exposed to summers that the county was seeing more often. He could not abandon the confinement operation. What he could do, and eventually did, was fence off a 4-acre woodlot on the west end of his property and acquire 8 Ossabaw gilts from Bodie's herd, at a price they agreed on in about 3 minutes without a middleman. He started his rotation the following May, with Lena's notebook as his guide and Bodie 2 phone calls away if he had questions. Lena had by then connected 4 other producers in Crawford and Pike counties to the Food Hub network. 2 of them were in the process of establishing heritage rotations on timber ground that had been doing nothing productive for years. One was a woman in Pike County named Carla Das, who had inherited 40 acres of mixed hardwood from her father and had been told by 2 different advisors that the land's highest use was to lease it to a logging operation. Carla's first 8 Ossabaw animals came from the Vance farm in the fall of 2022, and by the spring of 2023, her soil probes were already showing the beginning of the organic matter climb that Bodie's blocks had taken 18 years to reach. The process was not fast, but it had begun. Lena had also begun writing down what she was learning in the spiral-bound notebooks she had started in 2019, setting down the rotation principles, the soil probe protocols, the mast mapping approach that Bodie used to plan each block movement by walking the slope in September, were producing heavily and which were light. She wrote down the finishing observations, the butchering sequence, the rendering method for the lard, the notes on what Stovall's buyers looked for and how the Ossabaw fat profile differed from what the commodity pork market produced. She wrote down the things Bodie said when he was not thinking of it as instruction, which were the things that contained the most. By 2023, she had filled 6 notebooks. She offered to type them up and organize them into a guide she could share with the other producers in the network. "The notebooks are fine," Bodie said. "Paz." She typed them anyway, on winter evenings, and gave bound copies to each producer who came to the farm to learn the rotation. Bodie read one. He said she had gotten most of it right. The 3 acres the old deed had never listed were not a legal mystery. They were a surveying omission from 1934, when the original boundary was run in a year of high undergrowth, and the southeast corner of the Vance property had been estimated rather than walked. The correction had never been filed because no one had disputed the boundary in 90 years. In 2022, when Lena had a formal survey done as part of a conservation easement application, the surveyor found the omitted corner, and the 3 acres were added to the deed of record. They were the deepest part of the east slope timber, where the mast was heaviest and the soil structure was most fully developed, and they were worth more per acre in productive value than any other ground in that county if you were measuring the right things. Which brought up the question the whole story is really about: what are the right things to measure? Gerald Fitch came back to the farm once more in the fall of 2022. He had retired, but he was still connected to the Extension office through a volunteer advisory role, and the new specialist had told him about the Vance operation and asked if he knew the history. He called Lena, and she told him to come out. He walked the routing blocks with her. He was 66 years old, and his boots were muddier than they had been in 2009, because he no longer had anywhere to be after the visit, and he stopped being careful about them somewhere in the second block. At the fence, he read the soil probe data Lena had printed for him. He looked at the infiltration numbers from Dr. Cole's study. He was quiet for a long time. "I told him it was a recluse's hobby," he said. "He kept the folder," Lena said. "He used it under a chair leg." Fitch smiled at that. A small, private smile, the kind a person makes when they have caught themselves clearly and without escape. He asked Lena if she would walk him through the rotation protocol. He took notes in a small pad he carried in his shirt pocket. He asked if he could share the soil data with the current extension team, with Bodie's permission. She said she would ask. Bodhi said yes. He said it in the way he said most things, which was simply and without conditions. What Fitch had believed in 2009 was not wrong exactly. It was right for the model he had been given, which was a model of inputs and outputs and per hundredweight margins and processor contracts, a model that measured what was easy to count and left out what was slow to accumulate. The per hundredweight margin on an Osaba hog in 2009, sold at whatever premium specialty market existed then, would not have penciled out against a modern commercial operation in the short term. Fitch had been accurate about that. What his model had no column for was a 12-year accumulation of soil structure and a metabolic trait bred by 4 centuries of island isolation and a fat distribution profile that made a chef in Nashville stop negotiating. His model had been right at the wrong time horizon. The Vance farm held 140 acres and 50 hogs and one granddaughter with 6 spiral-bound notebooks and a rotating group of neighboring producers who drove out on Saturday mornings to walk the blocks and ask questions. The purchase order from Stovall was filed in the farmhouse under the kitchen lamp, which was the same lamp Bodhi's grandfather had used, and it would have yellowed and been forgotten, except that Lena laminated it. She said it was a historical document. Bodhi said she was being dramatic. She said she had learned that from him. The farm dog, a red heeler named Cord, who had been 5 years old when Stovall's purchase order came, was 12 now and still working the perimeter of the rooting pen each evening, moving the animals back from the fence line the way he always had, slow and deliberate and without wasted motion. He did not know the number on the purchase order. He did not need to. He knew the fence and the animals and the shape of the work, and he did it the same way every evening in every season, and the hogs respected him. What is patient endures, what is uniform breaks against the thing it cannot account for. A system that measures only what is easy to count will eventually be corrected by what it left out. The right things to measure are the things that are still there when the heat comes.